From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
So we are commencing the audience participation, which is the finale to the DC part of the Section 1201 hearings. And I will say that I think the two participants we're going to hear for are people who are unable to attend the Los Angeles hearings for specific classes, and that's what they wish to speak on. So we're going to have a slightly different format. We'll go, I think, probably one than the other. First focusing on Class 8, which is computer programs, video game preservation. And I think we are going to hear from Mr. Freeze first. If you want to state your name, your affiliation, and I believe we have demonstrations, which will start with 8A, and then if we have two, the second will be 8B.
Great. My name's Freeze. You've got
Please use the microphone. The microphone.
All right.
Yep.
My name's Freeze. You got my last name right, which I appreciate. Still not. Oh, it's got to be red. Oh, I got to push it and hold it. See, this is too technical for me. I'm sorry.
Oh.
I think, I mastered it now. Anyway, can I get up there and give my little talk?
Please, yep. And I think there's a microphone there too if you
Yeah,
choose to
and I
use
think
it.
we tested it before. I think it's on. So. All right. All right. Hey, thanks a lot for having me here. Not a lawyer. I've never done this before. Most of my friends are going to be testifying in LA on this. But I was going to be here, so thank you for the chance to come and speak to you. A little bit about me. I've been making games since I was a little kid. Went to work for Microsoft in 1986, worked on Excel for 5 years, worked on Word for 5 years, then got to do what I really wanted, which was build Microsoft's game business, built it up, launched the Xbox, retired, and now I do for-profit and non-profit board work. I'm on the Board of Commissioners of Smithsonian American Art Museum, which is why I'm in town. And I also do some video game preservation work that I'll talk about in a minute. Video game preservation is really important. That's what I want to tell you with this slide. It's really a new medium, a new art form, a new medium of communication. And it's only been around about 40 years. The first real video game, I think, was produced in 1962, a game called Space War. The first arcade video game in 1971, a game called Computer Space. So we're kind of at this time when the people who worked on those early games are dying. And so we need to go and capture what they know, record it, interview them before it's gone. And the games are disappearing too, and we need to capture and preserve those. Business is huge. It's bigger than movies. It's bigger than music. It's become one of the biggest mediums of communication that there is. And this particular item that we care about is about extending protections that already exist for offline games and preserving offline single-player games to preserving online multiplayer games. And we think the same rules that apply to the offline should apply to online. Let me talk about these online things. They get called this weird word MMO or MMORPG. It stands for Massively Multiplayer Online. They're the first virtual worlds. They're the first times that human beings got together and met in a virtual space. And for that reason alone, they're really important. The problem with them is they're very difficult to preserve. You know, if I buy a cartridge for an Atari game made in 1977, I can still plug it into my Atari today and hook it up to my TV and play that game. But these games are really, you can think of them as having two pieces. One that plays on your local machine, whatever that is, and another that plays on a server or in the cloud. And it's that server piece that usually disappears. When a company goes out of business, it's just gone. The software's gone, and it'll never run again. It's like we really only have half the game if we don't preserve the server side.
Can I ask you,
Sure.
So how in your view would you preserve the server side?
Well, I mean, there's groups that are dedicated to preserving software and preserving games in particular. Three that I work with are the MAID in Oakland. That's one of the groups that's going to be testifying. A second one is the Video Game History Museum in Frisco, Texas. A third one closer to home here is in Rochester, New York. It's called the Strong Museum of Play, and they do some great work there. So those are the kinds of institutions where we would see this preservation work happening. My last bullet point, I mean, it's a little hyperbolic maybe, but really this is an evolution of the human species. I mean, this is the first time we go from just meeting physically to also having places where we're interacting in a virtual world. And I think that's going to be something we'll look back on not just 50 or 100 years, but 1,000 years from now. And this will be a point in time when that happened. So it's important to preserve. I do preservation work. Most of the work that I do focuses on a period right when the arcade video games were first coming out. I mentioned Computer Space before. The first arcade video game came out a year before Pong in 1971. I wrote the only article that exists about the first color arcade video game, which is a game called Color Gotcha. I wrote the article about the first Easter egg in a video game, which is not the one that appears in Ready Player One, but is actually before that, 2 years before. So anyway, this is something that's near and dear to my heart as somebody involved in the game business for a long time.
Do you want to explain, I know you're not a lawyer, but in connection with the prohibition on access controls, why an exemption might be necessary for preservation? Like, is it not possible to get permission from the people who are the copyright owners for this preservation work? Tie it into the proceeding a bit.
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of the stuff that I do, the companies are either no longer exist, or they exist, but the rights could have been sold through multiple versions of companies. By now. Like, there is a company called Atari now, but it has nothing to do with the original Atari. And when we go back and try to find information about what happened in Atari in the early 70s, all of it, well, it's a slide. Let me just, these are my next two slides, so let me just go on. In many cases, the only comprehensive sources of information are things that I've written or other people like me have written. The companies are long gone. They've been sold, and I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. And if we don't preserve them, this important history is going to be lost. Companies cannot be relied on to preserve their own work. This is to your point. Maybe that sounds a little controversial, but I take Atari as an example. The company was acquired by Time Warner and then run out of business in the early 80s. They took everything they owned. Some of it they buried in a landfill in New Mexico, which was recently excavated. Most of what exists today either is something that employees were working on and took home to their house, or stuff that people rescued out of dumpsters when the company went out of business. If we didn't have that stuff, we wouldn't have the information we have about the early days of the video game business. So it's scary to rely on companies because they don't necessarily make this a priority. It's even worse, unfortunately, with the kinds of games we're talking about today, online, massively multiplayer games. A company is running this thing for profit. When it stops making money, they shut it down, and they have no real incentive to preserve it. And at that time, for those few years, it doesn't seem important. But then you look back at it 10 years later or 20 years later and realize that in the context of history, it was very important. But it's gone forever. Unfortunately, more and more games today are games like that. So you may notice, you download a new game on your cell phone and then you get on an airplane and turn on airplane mode and all of a sudden you can't play the game anymore. It's because it's really only part of it lives on your phone and part of it's now out in the cloud somewhere on a server. And so more and more games are being built that way. It makes sense to build games that way, but it's really a nightmare for preservation because there's no local copies that are being preserved. So it's an area that we need to enable these groups that preserve this software. We need to give them ways to do it legally. Getting ahead of my slides again, but that's why we need this. First of all, again, I'm not a lawyer, but when I see what's allowed today for single player and LAN games, we're just asking for those same things extended out to online and multiplayer games. That work would be done inside institutions like the 3 that I mentioned already. It's the right place for it. And they will, in many cases, need to cooperate with other experts to do that work, and they should have the right to do that.
So practically, how are they going to do that, though? I think the one example that you gave, dumpster diving, how are they accessing these works? You know, if we still have a qualification that the people who are doing these circumventions must lawfully access the work, how are they ever going to obtain them without the participation of the different companies that create them?
Yeah, I mean, on the lawful thing, I'm not going to speak to, but I can talk to the technical part. There's really 2 choices. One is that you have access to the original source code. So in the case of MAID, they're trying to bring back a MMO, an early online game. And fortunately, they have access both to the source code and to the hardware itself, the custom hardware that it ran on. And they've been able to bring the game back to life because of that. But is it legal what they've done? I don't know. And I think that's why they really care about this rule. The second option is to recreate the server software. That has been done illegally by people around some very popular games. For example, people have built illegal versions of the server-side code for World of Warcraft. It shows that it can be done. You have sort of a well-defined, what we programmers would call an API, a program interface that the client side, the part that's on your local machine, uses to talk to the server side. And so based on that API and the structures that get passed back and forth, it is possible to create something on the server side that acts like the original server code. And so I suspect in cases where the source code is lost, that kind of work would be done.
So I can sort of imagine a range of different ways that the gameplay is split between the client and the server, right? So at the very low end, maybe all the server is doing is sort of authenticating that you have a license, or maybe a little bit beyond that would be sort of coordinating what's your high score right now, where on the map are you,
Right.
that sort of thing. But then when you go beyond that, sometimes it, actually is streaming the, game assets to you in real time, the images and sounds and maps and all of that.
Yeah.
So, how do you go, so when it's the latter, when, it's actually the game assets that are, being stored on the server, how would you go about, re-implementing that?
Yeah, fortunately, typically it's not the assets that are streamed. Usually the assets are kept locally. Usually there's 2 things that are going on. One is they want to keep the bandwidth, the amount of data that's communicated back and forth between the server and the client relatively low, because that can have a cost implication for them. But the second thing is, in many cases, they're moving things onto the server side to prevent cheating, okay? When it's on the client side, that client could be hacked by a player, and all of a sudden a player has a super high score, or can unlock stuff that they should be paying for, that kind of thing. The companies want to prevent that, and so because of that, they push things into the server where they have total control over that. Somebody at home can't presumably hack the server, so it's really keep the amount of bandwidth low. But put all the important stuff on the server. So like every time you kill a monster, the fact that you get experience points or something like that. Every time you buy or sell something, every time you trade something. And so if you take that server piece out, yeah, you may have the assets. It's nice to have the assets locally, but the game won't run.
Okay, so you think that more often than not, it's not a challenge of having to recreate the assets necessarily if you don't have the server code. Right? Is that right?
Correct. So I've run a little business for 10 years in cooperation with Blizzard and World of Warcraft, where I 3D print World of Warcraft, licensed 3D print World of Warcraft characters for people, companies called Figure Prints. We have no access to the server side. We can pull up and recreate all the characters with all their armor and weapons and everything, just using the local data, client-side data.
In respect to MMOs, and not just other games that have, this remote server issue, but MMOs are built by the players. When the game is gone, some games like The Sims or Minecraft might have stuff that can't be replicated even if the game is restored. Is that right? Is there an element of this that is dependent on the players of the time who, incorporate their own features into the game? Because these massively, multiplayer games have more than one element going on. It's not just the servers being down that causes you to not be able to replicate the game. It's that the players and their additions to the world are no longer there.
It's actually relatively unusual to have those kinds of additions. I mean, first of all, Minecraft I would call an online game, but I wouldn't call it an MMO. There are people who've sort of built extensions to Minecraft that act that way, but typically what happens is, typically the reason that you don't let players do a lot of building out in the real world is because they fill the real world with crap that you don't want. And they discovered this with Ultima Online and other things, where they let people build houses, and pretty soon the game was filled with houses everywhere. Then you have to have all kinds of rules, and it starts to seem too much like the real world. So typically people who run, they're trying to create a certain feeling of a fantasy environment or something like that. Typically, they keep pretty tight control over what can be in those worlds, and that's really the kind of thing that you're trying to preserve. But around something like Minecraft, who owns what? I mean, that's a better question for you than me, right? If I buy Minecraft, but then I build a really cool castle, is it my castle because it's just like a painting tool that I painted a castle? Like if I use a painting program and I paint something, I assume I own it because I painted it. If I do that in Minecraft, 3D blocks instead of pixels, do I own it? So anyway, but I don't want to take you down that road.
You bring up
I think that's a bit of a digression.
Yeah.
You bring up an interesting point about control in your history and your work, as someone who's contributed to video games. Do you understand, or do you agree with the concept that these publishers would like to continue control for maybe some copyright reasons and some non-copyright reasons? For example, you brought up cheaters or people who are abusive to players, or are those reasons legitimate, or can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So is that if I were running one of those companies, which I did for a bunch of years, my concern would be about people taking my intellectual property and using it for financial gain. And so that would typically be the place that I would go. If somebody, Halo is a game that we published. If somebody was making Master Chief T-shirts and we weren't getting our licensing fee, I'd have an issue with that. If a museum was preserving our software for perpetuity, I don't see, which is a completely non-commercial use, I can't imagine having an issue with that as someone who ran a major publisher. So I don't understand what the issue is. And, if these things are kept within these institutional contexts, maybe there's some things about making sure that the work that they do is kept in a secure way, that it couldn't leak out to a pirate or something like that. There could be some legitimate concerns there that I think could be addressed. But anyway, go ahead. It looks like you have something you want to say.
So there's been some assertions that museums won't act as we traditionally think of museums, but will be basically arcades. They're charging admission to play games. Do you have that concern? Do you have thoughts on that? Is there some way to kind of outline what is okay and what's not, in your view at least?
I haven't given it a lot of thought. I think it's a valid concern that needs to be addressed. I know of an arcade that operates as a museum, that calls himself a museum, but charges people admission, and they come in and they play the games. And these are arcade games. It's not a great comparison, because in an arcade context, you buy the machine and then you can make as much money as you can off of it. There's not a license fee that goes back to the creator. But I know from the three institutions that I mentioned that that's not how they operate. But I think it's right to have rules around commercial or non-commercial use. That, you know, the research preservation work should be non-commercial, whatever that means.
So you made mention before about the important thing to you is, you know, the financial parts of this. Can you talk just, and I'll let you move on to whatever else you
No,
would like to mention.
I'm done, by the way.
Okay.
It's a good time for questions.
But in reference to, you know, this was your career.
Right.
Back when you made mention of, you know, for example, some games, the E.T. game was buried in the desert.
Yes.
There are.
I didn't say that, but I'm impressed you knew which one they were digging up.
There are some games more and more,
Yeah.
whether they're kind of these, you know, external server games, or what's generally retro gaming is kind of, they're developing more markets for these. As someone who's worked in this industry, is that something that you have concerns about, an exemption getting in the way of, you know, the market for reissued or remastered works?
I don't. I'm a big participant in the retro growth of the retro community. I speak at retro conferences. I mean, the one in Portland now is about 20,000 people there, and it's great. It's great for the industry. It's great to see people embracing collecting and preserving, you know, these games. So I'm a fan of that. I think, you know, companies like Nintendo have legitimate, you know, they're still doing things with Mario, you know, which is one of their first characters, and they should be able to do that. And they're the only ones who should have the right to make money off Mario. I agree with all that. But if a museum wants to preserve things related to Mario so that they're not lost in the future, I don't see how those two things have to be mutually exclusive, I guess is what I'm saying.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I think now we're going to turn to Ms. Rose, if you wanted to state your name, your affiliation, and if you can focus first on Class 8, the video games issue, and then we'll move to the other class.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Meredith Rose. I'm Policy Counsel at Public Knowledge, and I am an attorney and also an avid gamer, though I do not have the industry side experience. But I just sort of wanted to speak here both to answer some questions and to draw a focus to some of what we talked about in our support comments, which is the fact that the current exemption as it stands relies on distinguishing a complete game from a non-complete game, which we've sort of seen play out in this notion of online versus offline components. And to draw attention to the fact that the current evolution of video games is blurring that line to the point where the distinction as it stands is becoming increasingly unworkable. So I have a sort of a short AV presentation of some of these games that I think illustrate the point rather well.
Great, let's start with that. I don't know, does she need help queuing it up, or is it queued up? We're going to get it queued up, and that will be Exhibit 8B.
Yeah, so just want to apologize in advance. I have never used iMovie, and so some of these transitions are a lot flashier than they realistically need to be for a government setting. So all of these games are, this is all screen capture off of me playing these games actually last night. So these are all very popular. These are 3 extremely popular games that are known partially for the fact that they have these innovative multiplayer elements to them, and I'll try to sort of explain them as we go. So I may start and pause the video. And so this is sort of non-traditional and what we call mandatory multiplayer. So this is a game called Journey from 2012. This is actually a typical game. Artistic merits here. Journey largely plays as a single-player journey through the circuit. You can see how broad and open this world is. 90% of the time you're alone. Once in a while, someone else who's also playing a single-player game will be transported into the same server as you, and so you sort of incidentally see running into someone right there. And pick up the sound. The only method through which you can communicate with other players are these chirps, which show up with a small icon above your head. But that's the limitation of your ability to communicate, so it's largely based on bouncing and chirping at people. And you have no other meaningful way of interacting with them. And so in this particular case, I'm in white. I'm sort of leading the person in red off to what is an Easter egg in the game. And then you get sort of a sense when you go far enough away, the corner of the screen lights up in a bright white to show that they are starting to fade out of your game. This is another game called Dark Souls. I'm going to pause it here because this takes a little bit more explanation. Dark Souls is a single player in every traditional sense of the word, sort of dungeon grinder. You know, it's known for being very punishingly difficult. That's kind of its marketing point. But you play it essentially as a single-player campaign, but there are various multiplayer elements that are interspersed throughout it in very interesting and innovative ways. So there's kind of two sort of red stains in front of me, and which I'll sort of talk about when they get to. But interestingly, when I loaded up the game, something unexpected happened, if it'll pull up here. You'll see a ghost walking off to the right-hand side of the screen. That's someone else playing the game in real time somewhere else in the world, who just incidentally happened to pass by the spot where I was standing. And they got far enough away, and then they faded out of my game. So what I'm about to do is touch a blood stain. These are dynamic elements that show up in the world. When you run into a blood stain, it means that someone has died at the spot you are standing relatively recently in the game. And if you touch the blood stain, it will show you their last moments as a red ghost. You don't actually see what they're fighting, so it's kind of used as a strategic way to get a preview of what's coming up. So, touch a blood stain, and there's a ghost of someone presumably getting murdered by the boss who used to occupy this spot. And that's it. These are messages which are left by other players. There's a very limited set of words. There's a word menu that you pick from to leave them. Occasionally you can leave them like this person did with a recording of a preset gesture that you make. But you cannot just manually enter letters and type your own message. You have to pick from this sort of pre-existing list. Sometimes they're tactical hints, sometimes they're just things like that. Rants of the game. Sometimes they get a little more off-color depending on your flavor. This is Animal Crossing, which we mentioned in our filing, is one of the most popular games of 2017. So there's no sound on this one. It's an iPhone game. It's made by Nintendo. It's part of a franchise that they've been, I believe, dates back to the mid-90s. And essentially, you play as this sort of cute avatar, and you're the mayor of a town that is inhabited by little animals, and you harvest trees for fruit, and you go and you plant flowers, and it's almost like a farming simulator in some ways. It's just kind of an idle time killer, frankly, time suck in my life. And one of the features of this is it is sort of what we consider mandatory multiplayer. So almost the entire game, you at no point have to interact with another person, but you must be connected to the internet because you will run into, in every stage, you will run into avatars of other people. So this is someone playing elsewhere in the world, not dynamically, this is just they've picked a random avatar from other people who are playing in the world, presumably from Japan, given the character's name. I don't know this person. I've never met them in my life. I have no connection to them. Their avatar's been dropped unceremoniously into my game. And you can interact with them in a bunch of ways. You can buy things off of them. I think I bought a fish. You exchange money with them. And then you can do things like you can go visit every character. You build a campsite. That's kind of the square zero for these games, is when you start building a campsite. So I went to go visit this person at her campsite, and it brings up once you get through some campsite wisdom, and other various ads, You get deposited at a mock-up of what their campsite looks like, complete with the animal villagers who have come to populate their campsite. There is no way to actually exchange messages with these folks. I think I do the closest thing that you can, which is called giving kudos, where you'll see this in a second. You give kudos, and literally all you do is clap at them, and that's it. And if you as a player receive a certain number of kudos in a day, you get a bonus item. That's it. You cannot play this game on airplane mode. It must have a server connection at all times. It is not a traditional MMO in any stretch of the imagination, but at the same time, it is a single-player game in which there are multiplayer elements that are mandatorily injected into the game, which you can choose to take advantage of or not,
And
as you decide. And then I started picking peaches.
This is only playable on a smartphone?
Yeah, this is an iOS game. I don't believe there's I'm not sure why it's loading again. But yeah, I don't believe there's an Android equivalent. It's only iOS. But there are other iterations of this game that don't have the multiplayer elements that are on things like the various Nintendo handheld consoles. Just go plop back down. So I just kind of wanted to bring these up as examples of where traditionally, games that are considered a single player in the traditional sense, and to frankly, if you didn't know any better, you'd think you were playing a single player game, and not necessarily having to take advantage of any of the multiplayer elements, do have these sort of injected multiplayer aspects that do require an ongoing server connection to somewhere in the world and are arguably foreclosed from preservation by the state of the current exemption.
So what is your response to ESA's assertion that the adverse effect is not caused by TPM, but from the servers shutting down, which is a different issue?
I think that is certainly a factor. The adverse effect, I can't speak to the engineering aspect of this because I'm not an engineer and I think those are questions more properly posed to MAID. But I will say that so perhaps to sort of illustrate, folks may or may not be familiar with the Nostalrius issue. So Nostalrius was a server from World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft began, I think it went live in 2004, 2003, 2004, it went version 1.0, people fondly referred to as vanilla World of Warcraft, and it's now been going for 14 years, and there have been immeasurable tweaks under the hood, not only aesthetically to the actual assets in the game to make it look prettier. There have been expansions of things like classes and races and areas, and there have been actual expansion packs. But at the same time, there have also been tweaks to the mechanics of the game. And to the result where the World of Warcraft that I played when it first came out in 2004 is unrecognizable when looking at the current game. Other than essentially the name. Some of the classes remain the same, but there's a lot of the game that has very fundamentally changed. There is a sort of dedicated following of vanilla World of Warcraft, circa 2004. And so a bunch of these fans decided they didn't like the way that the game looked now, and they wanted to be able to preserve the game that they knew and remembered. And so what they did was they spent years essentially reverse engineering the server-side outputs. This was a very painstaking process from all indications, but they put it up as a free-to-play, semi-private server. I believe there was an invitation required, but it was relatively easy to get, called Nostalrius, as a play on nostalgia. And you could create a character, and you could bop around. This was not connected to the greater World of Warcraft servers run by Blizzard.
Is this what Mr. Freeze was talking about?
With the World of Warcraft?
It's a different one than I was referring to, but it's very
Hit the mic.
Yeah, same game, same. Oh, sorry. A different one than I was referring to, but it's the same game, same technique, where you completely reconstruct the server side. Yeah.
Okay, so you were talking about were you talking about in a more preservation context versus?
No, I was talking about the opposite. I was talking
Okay.
about more of a pirate version that has been done by pirates.
Okay, how is Ms. Rose's example of the vanilla World of Warcraft reconstruction more or less of a pirate version? I'm just trying to understand the differences.
I'm not sure what her point is either,
Okay.
so
Yeah,
I'll let her say.
I guess my point in all of this was it ran in the sort of life cycle of it was that it was up, and then they got a notice from Blizzard, it was taken down, and now Blizzard, I believe, has a plan to actually start offering vanilla World of Warcraft servers that people can log into and get this old experience. That would not have happened had it not been for a fan preservation movement. Having said that, I bring up this example primarily to draw attention to the fact that these games, especially MMOs, which do have a sizable amount of things like mandatory patching, mandatory downloads, mandatory expansion packs in a lot of cases, where you don't have to buy the expansion pack until you do, and it's been out for a certain amount of time. That these make very difficult preservation issues, and to avoid getting too philosophical, I won't get down the rabbit hole, but, at what iteration can you preserve something? And because these issues of preservation exist when you have so much control that is stacked on the side of the developers, essentially these newer versions of World of Warcraft sort of overwrite history, and so this raises very difficult preservation issues.
Well, so yesterday we were talking about software preservation more generally, including whether if an exemption were recommended by the Copyright Office, whether it should include or not include video games. And, one question is, are you saying it's difficult to tell whether a specific version of a video game is commercially available in the market or not?
I think that's accurate, yeah. And there are certain times when I think looking at games as iterations is something that's just generally lost in the discussion.
Is it not noticeable or marked on the game when you're purchasing the software, logging in or?
So if I went and purchased World of Warcraft today, it would be mandatory that I am updated to whatever the latest version is that is available from Blizzard, who's the company who develops it. And there is a notice when you log in, usually in the lower left-hand corner, it'll say version 14.0 point whatever it happens to be at the time. On the box, usually what you get just says World of Warcraft. And it will have sometimes, again, this is assuming people buy it off a box, which is also becoming rarer and rarer. But usually when you purchase it, it'll just say the general title of the game. It won't have any indication as to what the current version is, because they're not going to reprint boxes every time there's a new iteration. So I believe that, the expectation from a consumer is that when you buy one of these games and when you download them or purchase them in the store, you're going to be forced to update to whatever the most recent iteration is. So if I wanted to go out and buy the World of Warcraft I played 14 years ago, I have no option for that.
In looking at those kind of patches that we've been talking about, and not the upgrades like the expansion packs, you mentioned, I think both in your submission and now, that there's kind of different versions of these patches. Some are for gameplay, new characters, new options, things like that, and some are for interoperability. So the game continues to work. Is there a difference between those two? Should one be preferred over the other in terms of preservation uses? Because I think there might be a concern that there's some sort of contention between wanting to be able to exercise your derivative work rights as a copyright owner and make alterations to the expressive elements in the game, versus having someone preserve something that's not related to what your intended expression to be. I think some of the submissions talk about maybe deleting items. I know there's, for example, Modern Warfare 2 had a multiplayer map that had an offensive display in one of the multiplayer portions. Shouldn't the copyright owner get to remove that from the game? Versus, are there other issues, about adding stuff, and it should be to the copyright owner to decide when and under what circumstances that they want to make creative additions to their game? And how is there a tension with preservation in that context?
There's sort of two issues that I want to bring up in response to that. One is that you're correct, there are sort of a variety of issues that are addressed in patches. They tend to be bundled together, and so isolating one patch from the one that comes out a week later, as this one is a security patch and this one is an aesthetic patch, it's usually functionally impossible because there's elements of all of them that are mixed in. And the sort of, a lot of times the functionality elements of the game in these patches, updating functionality, bug fixes, they are mandatory because of the nature of an MMO. All players must have this, and so it's uniformity is really one of the key aspects of these. So you cannot decline to update, when they, I'm gonna get really nerdy here, when they nerfed the undead priest in World of Warcraft, which was one of the great tragedies of my high school life. they changed the stats for one particular class. Everyone playing the game had to accept these changes to that class. It had to be universal across the board or you were not allowed to log in. The second point is that the issue of authors writ large attempting to make broad creative revisions to their works is not unique to video games. We run into this specifically in another very nerdy case, Star Wars. If you look at the original trilogy, episodes 4, 5, and 6, there is an ongoing gripe among the Star Wars fan base community that George Lucas, when he sort of issued the reissues in the late 90s, pulled all of the older original versions of the movie from circulation, and you cannot obtain them commercially today. And he has gone on record in interviews saying, well, that earlier version prior to CGI wasn't the most perfect vision, and I believe that it is my right to pull these earlier iterations of my work from circulation until I feel it is perfect. To which our response is, rationally, and I think also this holds up in copyright law, is that once it has been issued into the stream of commerce, you don't continue to have the right to undo that. And to pull it from the stream of commerce until you feel more satisfied with it.
Are you talking about the first sale doctrine?
Yeah, that's part of it. I was speaking more of a philosophical level, but that is correct. And again, I acknowledge that first sale doctrine in the context of things like video games and digital distribution runs into a lot of problems, so I don't want to sort of lean into that too much, except to flag that this idea that I have the right to revise my creative vision at any time is a very suspect claim, not only from a legal perspective when you get the first sale doctrine, but also from a philosophical one as to functionally how copyright actually works.
Okay, so I think we're going to try to keep moving to be mindful of time. Do you have more questions, Mr. O'Reilly, on Class 8? Nope. Does anyone else wish to chime in Class 8? Hearing none, can you shift to Class 11, avionics?
Sure. Class 11 avionics, I mostly just wanted to present myself if there were folks who had any questions for the record. I am unfortunately not Bruce Jackson, and so I will not be able to speak directly to a lot of the more technical aspects, except to the extent that I can speak at a high level about them, but I just sort of wanted to make myself available to fill any gaps in the record.
I guess one question, Mr. Emer, my question too I have is it your, would you sort of draw an analogy for this petition to the current one for device on medical data? Do you think that what the avion, so this is an exemption for access to aircraft flight operations, maintenance, and security data captured by computer programs, is that data itself a copyrightable work? That would be something Bruce would be better to answer. My understanding from speaking with him and others in this field is that it is yes and no. Is it structured or unstructured data? Do you know?
So it is structured. It's structured according to it's structured according to open source standards. But it is not, a lot of this, so it's a combination of a couple of things. One is sort of the raw data coming in off things like wing sensors that measures things like airspeed and so on and so forth. The other is, I know specifically of interest to air informatics, is doing things like security penetration testing. Which tends to fall more in line with the sort of inquiry of the security testing panel from a few days ago, in terms of being able to do not only compliance work, to come into compliance with FAA mandates about onboard computer security, but also to do things like check for holes in the supply chain. That kind of thing, and that does require interfacing with copyrighted software. Some of this is raw data that they're seeking, and some of it is interfacing with copyrighted software. And as to the extent that those are separable, I believe you'd have to ask Bruce, frankly, because that's about the limit of my technical knowledge on it.
This also may be a question for Bruce, but I wonder if you have any sense of, to what extent the aircraft manufacturers do or don't make this information available to, to the people seeking it? Is it that they just flat refuse to provide it, or is it that they typically seek a license? Would be interested in any information you have about that.
So my understanding is that essentially the way the sort of supply chain works on these issues is there is the onboard computer, which typically is manufactured by GE or Honeywell, tend to be the two dominant players in this case. They are then purchased by Boeing, I believe, subject to a maintenance agreement. that says the only people who, and this is somewhat similar to the BMW repair case of a few years ago, where the only people who may perform any of this testing for compliance are licensed GE or Honeywell technicians. The results when you go to get that compliance testing done, my understanding is that most of the time you literally just get a certificate that says, you have passed security compliance. There's no details in it. Once in a while, my understanding is that you can get something slightly more detailed, but it is not comparable to the amount of data that would actually be obtainable if someone like Aeroinformatics were to go in and be able to do that for the client.
And do you know if so once they get the statement back that says, everything checked out, but it doesn't have the sort of more detailed information, do you have any sense of, whether they've kind of gone back then to the authorized provider to ask for that data, or is it just kind of a situation, where if they've done that, it's refused, or has there been a next step after that process?
I do not know.
Do you have a sense for, I kind of want to get at ownership of the aircraft versus ownership of the avionics system. I'm not sure what is typical. Maybe Mr. Jackson will be, in a better position to answer. But in terms of who is the owner or the licensee of the copyrighted work that this exemption would allow circumvention of the TPM of? Is it Boeing? Is it Honeywell? Is it someone who's bought an airplane?
I believe it would be Honeywell is the actual software ownership. You'd have to ask Mr. Jackson for a more specific. My understanding of it is that the physical plane can be owned or can be leased. I believe the more typical situation is that an operator like Southwest or United leases their planes from Boeing. But the operator is also the one, I believe, who performs the security, who is required to comply with FAA regulations. So they're the ones that have the regulatory compliance burden, but in, I believe, many cases, if not most, they are actually the leasing body and not the owning body.
And is it public knowledge's belief that were this exemption to be recommended and adopted, the activity is non-infringing under 107? Is it also 117 or just 107?
107, I believe.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate both of you for participating and for adding this information to the record. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.